the students for our third class in this amazing series titled How to Think Like a Black Jew. And the course is focused on this deep analyzation of African-American thought as it relates to Judaism, as it relates to the Torah. And we're bringing so many different exciting people to come and discuss with us. And this particular class is extremely important in this whole series. We're with Sar, is basically the spokesperson of the Dimona community. This is so incredibly important because we talked about last week with Rabbi Kish was the idea of how African Americans are connected directly to the Igbo people in Nigeria and there's other tribes as well, but specifically the Igbo people being one of the largest tribes in Nigeria who identify as Jewish, most of them. Some of them through conversion and other things have different faiths at this point, but they still know the original origin is Jewish. And the community in Dimona is probably one of the most precious pieces in this whole conversation, because it's one thing for people to go on an individual path to find their place with Judaism and the Torah. There's people who become Reformed Jewish, African Americans who become Reformed Jewish and conservative, and people like myself who become Orthodox, and some people go very far in their learning and these types of things. But there's another thing to see people who have not went into that rabbinical process of joining the mainstream Jewish world and had this self-determination, this independent self-determination to connect themselves to Israel, to connect themselves to the Jewish people here in Israel, and had a historic journey starting from Chicago. And Sar, he's a minister of information for the Dimona community, and a tremendous author, writer. I went down to Dimona to visit them, and I got all these messages for different publications saying, oh, you and Sar are together, and everyone was just really excited for us to connect. So maybe Sar Ahmadiel, is going to tell us a little bit about himself, and then we're going to segue that into the Dimona community, and then we'll build into a discussion.
I'm glad to be with dear brother Mordechai, and it's my divine pleasure to be with your students. And I hope that this is indeed refreshing and informative for them, and that it even becomes a catalyst for some of the radical changes that we must see be affected on our planet. I mean, that it's that broad for us. So I'm glad to be with you. And in my capacity as Minister of Information and the national spokesperson for the African Hebrew Israelites, I often engage with media, with anthropologists on that level. I'm constantly, regularly, as you already know, in defensive posture, to defend what our claims to the Israelite identity, to Hebraic identity, to the land of Israel. And it comforting and soothing at this particular point to be in your company. And first of all, when we met, it was timely because I had been kind of putting it in the wind. I said, we've got to build this bridge into this other community, that Orthodox community, because it is so much broader than our own individual religious and spiritual identities. So I'm just glad to be a part of this process, and I'm glad that this process has taken an accelerating turn.
I think the first question is how did you become the minister of information for the Hebrew Israelite community? And I mean, it's a huge thing, and maybe define to us the Hebrew Israelite movement, because there's so many different facets and factions within it. And sometimes people know the Hebrew Israelites as guys on the corners, and they have very unique outfits. And then you see people have organized like temples where people pray. They have communities and are very normalized.
But first, let me give all honor and praises to the Holy One of Israel and to his anointed. I greet everyone, Shalom Aleichem. How did I become the minister of information? I could go back to my upbringing as a child and having been a mischievous little boy and being on onus, being on punishment often in the house. And my parents had a little library, and I used to immerse myself in reading. I would spend time looking at the pictures of the encyclopedias first, and then a couple of years later, I began to read the captions under the pictures, and then I started actually reading the entries themselves. And so I became very intellectually driven. And so that is certainly one of those trajectories that my life was on that prepared me for what I do today. And I certainly can look back and see that that hand was guiding me in that way. But my path to identifying as a Hebrew Israelite came when I was in my late teens, very late teens. I had already gone through an awakening in America as far as the plight and the condition of the Africans in America. And it left me very angry. It was an awakening. I was raised pretty much middle class, even upper middle class in Washington, D.C., private schools, etc. And so to walk in the library and to be awakened in February with Black History Month, there was a revolutionary thing for me. And it left me very angry and bitter towards white people. Sadly, that meant towards my father's mother, which is a story that you might want to ask me about at the end of this. Nevertheless, I think I was amongst all of us as quote unquote African Americans, or Africans in America, as I would prefer to identify them as. We were left without an identity. We did not have any roots that we could point to in terms of our nationality. Sure, we came from Africa, but where in Africa? It's a huge continent. There's hundreds of ethnic identities in Africa. Where were we from? And so my first exposure to this idea that we were actually Hebrew Israelites was the outcome of a personal search and inquiry in which I did lots of research and asked questions and literally prayed for who am I? What am I supposed to be doing? Because by the time I was 21, I realized that the path that I had undertaken as a student at American University and attending, majoring in political science and actually interning and then later working actually on Capitol Hill, I realized very early on that that was not going to be my calling. I simply saw where the political path and the path of economic empowerment, which was being pushed for Africans in America at that point, didn't seem to me to be a legitimate course for me personally, and I didn't see it as something that was going to work for the masses of our people. There was something else I needed to know. And so that search continued, and it led me to Detroit, Michigan. I was visiting a friend, and her brother-in-law was an Israelite, and he invited me to a class. I didn't really know what I was going to, but when I went and listened to the elder teach, I just remember everything kind of like crystallizing and coming together for me. And it all just made sense. It made historical sense. It made spiritual sense for me. And I identified from that point as an Israelite. And it was 2 years later, that was 1975. It was 2 years later at a point of, okay, I'm an Israelite, but now what? That's when I found out about the brothers and sisters who had left in 1967 under the leadership of Ben Ami, who had the vision in 1966 that he was to lead the exodus of our people out in 1967. And so by this time, again, they're 10 years out of America. This is 1977. And so I was like, wow, they're 10 years ahead of me. I thought I was on the cutting edge. But it just, again, made sense. And again, I was led divinely to representatives that Ben Ami had sent to Washington, D.C., for the express purpose of setting up a jurisdiction to begin teaching, to begin recruiting, if you want to put it like that, although we kind of frown on that idea that we're not recruiting. We're simply, we're not converting or trying to convince anybody of anything. We're simply confirming that which the Most High has brought them to in terms of their own personal paths, in terms of their identity and their callings. And so in 77, I became immersed in the community, and the organization began to learn about its structures. By 78, I came to visit, and the rest is history. I've been a part of it ever since. For me, it was simply the vehicle by which I would then continue my growth and development in terms of answering the many, many questions in life that one encounters, and the identity issues that still, the history and all the missing pieces of our shattered and scattered identity. But this became that vehicle. And so I matriculated very quickly. I was an understudy of Prince Shaliach the former L.A. Bryant out of Indianapolis, who came to Israel in 1971 and became one of the 12 princes on the Holy Council. He became our community's historian and headmaster of the School of the Prophets here in Israel, and was under his tutelage for 2-3 years. And then I was named as Minister of Information by His Excellency Ben Ami. And I served until this day in that capacity. You're familiar with the term hasbara, which is simply public relations, it's information, it's propaganda in the good connotation. It is to interface with the media, to interface with the public, with the many groups that come to visit us, both internally in Israel and also those who come from overseas, from African communities or from African Americans or Europe, wherever they come from. They would generally interface with my particular ministry, and I have a staff that does that. And so that's the history of me involved.
I want to go back to the late 1960s when we first found out about this. When you're sitting in that first meeting or your first several meetings, what were the principles and the ideas that you heard that inspired you to want to shift your perspective about life? What were the core fundamentals that you learned about?
Again, for me, it was identity, and the narrative, the historical narrative, that we were not just people who hatched on plantations in America, that we had a rich past. And of course, to this day, people talk about we were kings and queens in Africa. Okay, where and when? Give me some specifics. And of course, we know that there was a huge break in that narrative for all of us crossing the middle passage and coming across the divide. And so for me, the narrative, as it was explained to me, just very generally at the time. And I have to say that since that time, again, I've been in this 47 years now. And for me, it's been a life choice to continue the research, to build on those who were my teachers, and to continue to find bits and pieces of this puzzle. And so what I heard at that time it just made sense, and I've been filling it in ever since. It's almost kind of like a hypothesis. And then you, as a scientist or historian or an anthropologist or an archaeologist, you go out and you look for the missing pieces, and they will either verify or they will contradict your hypothesis, in which case then you have to do some fine tuning or some refinements or some altering of your narrative. But in my case, everything that I have found subsequently actually makes perfect sense and fills in these pieces. And so the narrative goes like this, that when you go back to the land of Israel and the Israelites and the oppression and the occupation of the Romans during the Roman era, and approximately the year 70.
Fourth century.
Earlier, 70. That would have been the first century.
Okay.
So when you look at that very vile, that very violent, that very brutal, militaristic occupation, and of course the smashing of Israelite culture and the subsequent dispersion, it just made logical sense that when that occurred, that many of those who were living in the land of Israel would not have fled to the north, because that was the direction that the Romans were coming. You wouldn't beat a retreat in the direction of your adversary. And so we began to move, the Israelites began to move deeper south. And of course, that coincided with the fact that you've got a long history, thousands of years of history of mentions in the Hebraic Testament of our interaction and history in Egypt and with Ethiopia. And so it just made sense that we would flee in that direction. And of course, we could not carry artifacts. Those were basically stone. And there was no carrying of our written traditions and Torah at that particular point. Those were just too huge and heavy to bring. We had to carry changes of clothing and provisions and help elders and carry babies. And so all we had was an oral tradition. And so when you look at the migration patterns of many Africans across the continent, many of them have similar narratives. The Igbo, the Yoruba, the Lemba down in South Africa and Zimbabwe, they all claim to have come from Egypt and Israel specifically. When you look at the Ashanti and the Ga and the Ewe in Ghana, there are lots of what we call Hebrewisms. And that, of course, is taken from Joseph Williams' book, Hebrewisms of West Africa. Study he did in 1930, I believe it was published. And so when you look at, and I spent lots of time in Ghana. I've got a daughter that lives in Ghana. I go back to see her every now and then, and I attend a lot of the Panafest conferences, the Pan-African Festival conferences, and the scholarly exchanges and presentations that are made during that time. And we visit the slave dungeons, not castles. We didn't stay in the castle portions, but when you look at the culture of the people, for example, the Ga in the Accra region of Ghana, they practice a festival called Homowo, in which they take every year annually, they take red clay and smear it on the doorposts of their homes. And of course, I have newspaper accounts that interviewed 8 people. And out of those 8, the 4 elders who were inquired about that culture, they actually said, this is our history. This is our identification with the land of Israel, with the people of Israel. We're Israelites. Now, the 4 younger individuals, they had lost that connection. They couldn't speak to it, didn't bring it up. And so we saw how these pieces are lost, or these threads are very fine, but nevertheless they are there. In Ghana, when they say welcome, they say akwaba. And so, wait a minute, akwaba, barukaba. When they say boy, it's benyin, bain. When they say I'm coming, it's meba, aniba. When you say beautiful, it's yefet, yafa. And so it goes on and on, these connections, circumcision on the 8th day, separation of the women during their menstrual cycle and after childbirth. And so these Hebrewisms, these cultural similarities with biblical Israelites didn't fall out of the sky. This is a remnant of that which these migrating peoples brought into those regions. And so here's a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that when the slave trade began, when the commodity shifted from gold or palm oil or whatever it was, because there were centuries of trading going on with the Portuguese and other Europeans along the coastlines of West Africa long before the slave trade began. So when the commodity shifted and that well-established trading route was there, when the commodity shifted to people, who would these traders get? Do we assume that they were to go and capture their own people and sell them into captivity? Or did this coincide with the arrival of the migrating Hebrews who had been forced to continue to move over the course of several hundred years into those areas? And we would say the latter, that we came, we were rather numerous, we were beginning to pile up, might have been welcomed initially, but after a while you begin to use up the resources, the food. Your sons and daughters are trying to marry their sons and daughters. And so you can see where it might have been problematic. And so all of those things pointed to that it would have been Israelites captured. Other than that, and I think you would know that amongst many Afrocentric scholars, there's this rather absurd idea that Africans were not involved in the slave trade. And it's born out of a romantic notion and not wanting to think that we were involved in such a manner. But if you really look below the surface, what you're doing is you're giving Europeans quite a bit of latitude in terms of being able to say that the couple dozen at any one time that rode on shore, that they went into the interior of the continent and carried away millions of our people. I'm not ready to concede that. And so for me, absolutely other Africans were involved in the selling of these Africans, these new Africans. And we had a very much different connotation than it did once we arrived in the shores of the Americas. That was a different slavery altogether that had not been seen prior in terms of its brutality and its sole fundamental foundation resting upon the color of our skin. That's something that when we looked at it, it's our position that those were Israelites that were being captured and sold into slavery. And so now the next thing that we do is then connect up the threads that cross the Atlantic. And you find that Santeria in South America, the of what is now Brazil. Santa roots are Yoruba roots, are Israelite roots. When you train in Exodus and those kind of references, and the Rastafarian idea that Rastafari, Prince Tafari at birth, soon to be inaugurated as commemorated as His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I. We know that is a linkage of he was indeed the 225th king in the lineage of the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And so look at America, North America, that 60%, upwards of 60% of the Igbo, we were talking about this prior, Port of Charleston, they were actually recorded on the ship's manifest as being of Igbo origin. And of course, the Igbo have that strong connection to the Hebrews, and it's being recognized more and more today. And so fast forward, the expression of a longing for one's homeland that could not be expressed via reading, writing, preaching, or teaching, and was only expressed via song. What songs were sung in those plantations? We didn't sing about the river Niger, the Gambia, the Volta. We sang about the river Jordan. We didn't sing about Mali and Songhai and Timbuktu. We sang about Jericho, Jerusalem, and Canaan's land. Now, the first response that I had, and that others normally will have, is that, well, that's because the missionaries taught us the Bible and we associated our situation with that. But we have lots of references and research that shows that the Israelites, or those who were actually in West Africa, knew about the Bible, knew about their identity long before the first missionaries came. Mungo Park was one of them, the Scottish explorer who found a brother there. It was Fantuma. And he finds that this brother was a school teacher, and he had the Pentateuch. He had the book of Isaiah. He had the book of the Psalms in Arabic. And he was telling Mungo Park, this Scottish explorer, stories of Joseph and David and Solomon, and giving these stories as part of his own folklore. And when he finds out that Mungo Park knew the same stories, he's trying to figure out, how do you know my history? And so those kind of anecdotal and historical bits and pieces, again, of this shattered story and shattered narrative and shattered culture and identity, they just all add up. And so fast forward again, turn of the century, post-Emancipation Proclamation, you had what are known as itinerant preachers moving around the States. The Bishop William S. Crowdy's, Prophet William S. Crowdy, Bishop C.H. Mason, and others who were brought up in the idea that we were the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so fast forward one more time to the early 1960s, and our spiritual leader, Ben Ami, who was raised as a child hearing stories from his parents that he was an Israelite, he's at a water fountain in Chicago, and at his work, he was a metallurgist at a foundry there. And at a water fountain, one of the elders talks to him and says, "Hey, do you know who you are?" And when he hears that, it brings back all those memories, and he becomes a part of a Chicago area congregation known as a Beta Cultural Center. So he's asking questions. He's moving rapidly. He's studying Hebrew. He's teaching Hebrew. He's teaching current events and connecting the current events to prophetic events, prophetic passages in the scriptures. And so he moves very quickly, but as a young man in his early 20s at the time, early 60s, he's questioning his elders, and he's saying, well, when do we go back to Israel? And all of the elders had a similar story. It's funny because I'm in Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo as we speak, and I spent a day on my way here in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I spent the day with one of the leaders of a synagogue in one of the more impoverished areas of Addis Ababa, who are among the estimated 240,000 Ethiopian Jews that remain in Israel awaiting the opportunity for Aliyah. And so he and the other brothers I spent the day with were sharing the stories that their elders, they would ask the same questions, and their elders had the same response just in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that it's not time. And so like them, Ben-Ami would ask, well, what will make it time? What is it? What is the reason? It's this or that. And it didn't rest with him. And so in meditation on his bed in 1966, Ben-Ami is visited by the angel Gabriel, who
Wow.
instructs him in what he says is about a 45-second vision, that he is to begin the exodus of our people, and that the year of the exodus would be the following year, which would make it 1967. Ben-Ami wrestled with the idea because he joked about it. He said he thought the angel had the wrong address, but nevertheless convicted of the vision. He wrestled after a couple of weeks and he began to share it with his close confidants. And to his pleasant surprise, they began to encourage and support the idea. And they look up, and the next year they're actually making the Exodus. And the Exodus took form in the sense of one of the brothers said there's a passage in the scripture says you would return the same way that you left. And so everybody was like, okay, West Africa, but where in West Africa do we go? And another brother came and said, well, Liberia was founded by and for Africans in America. So someone said, well, let's go and check it out. So two brothers flew in advance and checked it out. And in fact, in Liberia's constitution, it required that they assist any of us that wanted to return. They came back with that report, and we look up, and the next year, 1967, 350 men, women, and children had left the confines of Chicago and Gary, Indiana areas, and were now living in West Africa. That became our wilderness experience, preparing us for the eventual return into Israel. We didn't feel we could just go back in there having the identity as ex-slaves, because slaves, unfortunately, or just logically, slaves have no love for self. They have such a torn down identity and narrow and deep inferiority complex that we knew that wasn't going to work. And so the experience in Liberia was to rid ourselves of all that negativity that had been acquired during the captivity. And so that was that chapter leading all the way up. So that's our narrative.
The thing that's so powerful about what you're saying is that, I mean, obviously there's differences, but this is exactly the way that the rabbi in the community in Nigeria described us leaving there through the transatlantic slave trade. And they've had this tradition since we left. They go even a step further, the community in Nigeria, and there's a pasuk in Genesis and Bereshit 15:13 that where God speaks to Abraham and says, your descendants will be enslaved for 400 years. Was it 400 years or 405 years, the African-American slave experience?
Well, there was an outpouring in 2019 of this idea. And of course, the 1619 Project, which became very controversial, the New York Times project with the sister Hannah and Nicole Jones, I believe her name is, or Nicole Hannah Jones. It became so controversial. But for us, we had already said, well, wait a minute, there's evidence, I think dating back to 1505 or 1503, of the landing of enslaved Africans on Hispaniola, the island that is half Haiti and half Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. And so that for us would have been the beginning of a 400-year chastisement or captivity. Nevertheless, we were happy that finally 1619, and 2019 rolled around, because for so long, people were telling us, and many of those Israelite groups that you spoke about earlier on the street corners of New York and elsewhere would lambast us and say it's not time. And so the 400 years to finally get there in the course of the personage of the 1619, 2019 commemoration, we were happy, because for us that meant no longer did we, and there's no way that we're supposed to be there already. And so that 400-year period was phenomenally critical for those of us who were awakening to that identity, because that linked us directly to Abraham's seed. That linked us directly, that experience. And we can look and say, what other people has had that kind of experience? And so it was very critical, very crucial to that sense of identity. But the 2019, we saw it come and we saw it go. And we see that there's not been a lot of movement. There's not been very much traction in terms of the aliyah, a move towards an aliyah. And of course, that takes us into an area of political discussions relative to the state of Israel and the law of return.
I think that deserves a whole segment in itself because there's so many details. But I can say from even in the mainstream rabbinical world and how a person like myself, like traditional, I'm not the first African-American rabbi. There's been many rabbis that have been in the religious system, but I could say that I think it was 2014, Rabbi Chaim Kanetsky sent a group of rabbis out to Nigeria, and they stayed there for a large amount of time, for months, and they came back with these reports. And from the reports, the chief of the whole Haredi community all over the world gave a pasak, a ruling that the Igbo people were in fact connected or part of Am Israel. And they just, because they've been living so separate and different dynamics, they would have to go through what they call a gerus humra, which is kind of like, it's a process of, it's like ceremonial. It's the same thing that many Spanish people who were Ladino had to go through this whole process, because even though they could identify and we knew that they were from that, it was still a reintegration process. Same thing Ethiopian, same thing even, certain people that have Ashkenazi backgrounds had to do the same. It's a normalized process, but the point is that once that ruling went down, that directly connects the African-American experience. And I want to see, how much information do you have about the Charleston experience with the people in the slave ships being identified as Igbos? Do you have any more information about that?
I would have to dig in the volumes and various references, but it's available. I could make it available.
But the thing now is, now that we are connected, how do we, and we're asking this question because the students are asking this narrative is now matching somewhat, there's differences, matching rabbinical narratives, the African-American narrative, which is kind of like a cognitive process of development of how they came to certain conclusions. But the people in Nigeria, their tradition for hundreds of years has been connected to this idea, and they have their unique aspects. And then we have a rabbinical discourse of the temple being destroyed and Jews being sold into Africa. And everyone agrees with that. And that's not counting the people who just migrated for resources. So there's so many variables to it. How do we bring all these dynamics together? And what is the process of reconnecting to our Igbo roots? It doesn't seem like that dynamic of reintegrating and reconnecting with the Igbo people specifically from an African-American perspective has really come to a fruition or become a national and international theme.
There's actually, we're victims of a actual suppression of this information. It's not like it's not there. I put together a traveling exhibition, Rabbi, in 1994 is when we opened it up. I worked on it in the late 80s up until 94, and we in February of 94 in Nashville, and London, one in South Africa, and one in Ghana. But the one that I opened up, they're all identical, but the one that I opened up in Nashville, I remember the inaugural week, and I was taking groups through, and I remember a white couple being there, and they basically heard the narrative basically saying that we are Israelites, we identify with Israel, we came from Israel, we're not just any Africans. And at the end of it, she says to me, she said, "We thought y'all knew." She knew the connection. And I asked her, I said, well, how were we supposed to know? Who was supposed to have taught that to us? And so just like in the 83rd Psalms, when it talks about those who are confederate against thee, those that hate thee have lifted up the head, and they have consulted together. And the objective was to remove Israel from their remembrance. We feel that that is specifically what has actually occurred to suppress and to obfuscate these narratives and these threads that just barely still allow us a toehold to get back that identity. But it's a little late now. We were able to do it. We've done it. It can't be undone. But nevertheless, we did have opposition from, and it's funny because you're mentioning the dispatching of those who went to Nigeria and came back with that ruling. But I also remember when the Supreme Court at Bagasse, the case of the Igbo in Israel came up, and Steve Kaplan, an Israeli anthropologist who really wasn't an expert in Igbo culture and identity, he was more, I think his roots were more into the Ethiopian connections, but he was the actual reference and the support that was drawn upon for the ruling that declared that the Igbo were not legitimate and to be considered as recipients of any aliyah privileges. And so it's been the academics, it's been the politicians, I'll say it, it's been certain other elements of the religious community. Yes, I'm sure that there have been certain individuals along the way. For example, Rabbi Shlomo Gordon, chief Ashkenazi rabbi, who on his Yom Kippur minyan in 1985 talked about how the Vilna Gaon sent messengers down to Ethiopia asking them to send rabbis to Israel. But where is that being articulated? Where is that being brought front and center to rectify what we would see as a wrong in terms of not opening the doors to this opportunity and to being embraced by the rest of the family as others have been? So it's not something that's on everyone's lips, but it's certainly growing and fast growing. There's an awakening that's taking place. And in our view, it's simply, you can't keep truth suppressed. You can't keep it down. You know, it's got to surface. It's got to rise. And no matter how much or how intensely you attempt to do it, it's going to squeeze through and eventually become known. And so for us, it's just a matter of time. We stay focused. We stay aligned with that objective to continue to make these claims more tangible, to add to the body of research that for us speaks clearly that these are very real links, and appeal to members of the other side of our family who have the sense of empathy and just rightness to reach out and embrace what this means.
So I think because there's a whole nother aspect, like you're saying, there's a political aspect, there's the actual Dimona community. They have been like huge contributors of like the whole vegan food movement here in Israel. There's a whole story on how you guys have lived here, even more stories about Liberia and that whole process of that exodus. So I want to stop the class here because this was like an introduction to Dimona, where we understood who you were, we understand the initial narrative, we understand the Hebrew Israelite movement a lot clearer now. And so I think stopping here would be the best way. And then from there, we could pick up on the part 2 of the class, which would be more focused on Dimona and the challenges that you're experiencing in Israel, and then also the future, and then more connections. And there's even a chance, I don't know how you feel about it, we can talk about it more in private, but even putting together a session, maybe in that class, with you and Rabbi Kish from Nigeria. So we could like really start this process of us talking to each other, because we're related. You know, it's not just a random two people with similar ideas. Like, we're related. And I think, you know, just to throw it out, like, you know, we could maybe even make it into a holiday of us reuniting, a date that signifies us reuniting with our brothers in a shared identity and shared spiritual identity and genetic identity, because we need to create like a tshuva for both of us. You know what I mean? Like, we need to, I mean, a lot of tears need to be shed and a lot of hugs need to happen, and opportunities of maybe marriage and other things can come out of this.
Right. To hear you say, you know, just in fairness to your students, I knew nothing about Rabbi Kish until we began to talk earlier today. And I wish I had an opportunity to have listened to that. And like you said, if narratives merge.
I'll send a class to you. And you'll see, I'm saying he's saying the same exact. It's amazing. And from my position, I really feel that there needs to be a international holiday of us reuniting with. I mean, because it's one thing that the slave ships and the ports and all that is very good from a Hebrewic, Jewish, Hebrew Israelite perspective, because they still refer to themselves as Hebrews as well too. And bringing that together, and then also a lot of the African American Jews who identify as Jewish, all bringing all three of those elements together. The Hebrew Israelites, the Igbos, and then people who are in the mainstream Jewish world from the African American perspective. And we'll figure out how to do it, but it's something we need to do. And I want to thank you for your time. And we should continue and do our second part. And at this point, I'm going to stop the recording for the students. Any last words you want to leave us with?
I absolutely enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to part two because there are so many layers to this and so many implications to this. And so it's a discussion that has long been needed. And the fact that we're having it, it's confirming for me. And so I look forward to the next.
Hold up, everything I do for your love. Trying to reach up to you, I be short some. I'm ready for change, I wanna know you. You let me go.